everybody. I'm Lauren, Director of Historical Programs at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. We're so glad that you've joined us again today for Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. This is History All Around Us Part 3, and Steve and Jane will be talking about Constitution and Delaware Avenues Northeast. And I'm going to turn it over now to Jane Campbell, President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Good morning. It is delightful to be here with you and once again enjoy the fascinating stories that Steve Livengood, our Chief Tour Guide and Director of Public Programs, has learned over his 50 years of providing tours for the Capitol. And today we are going to be taking a walk along the Capitol grounds, because actually the story of the Capitol is not just the building, but is the grounds around it and how it has developed. But even more important than any of that is the fact that the Capitol is, for America, sacred ground. It is, we call it our temple of democracy. It is the symbol of our representative government, of what we call we the people. And in our Constitution, the first article of the Constitution is the United States Congress. So it is appropriate that the home of the United States Congress, the Capitol, ought to be the symbol that is widely known across. And so before we get into today's conversation, I want to sort of give you a little sense of context. The Capitol Historical Society began these webinar series, our virtual digital learning, a couple weeks after we all got told we should work from home. And all of a sudden, much of our programming, which had been held at the Capitol, was no longer possible. And we knew that people were still very interested. And so we got about the business of learning how to create digital format. Thank you very much, Lauren, for stepping up and learning the Zoom platform as we move forward. Thank you, Steve, for doing an awful lot of walks and an awful lot of photography, putting the historical pictures with the current pictures. We don't know how many steps he's taken to create these, but we thank you very much for that work. All of these are available because we have a generous set of members of the Capitol Historical Society, and I want to make sure that any of you who are not now members take that opportunity. We welcome you into membership, and we appreciate your support. The other way that you can provide support is by purchasing some of our commemorative items. If you look carefully at Steve, you will see a lovely tie representing we the people. We have a whole series of ties for those people who are doing Zoom activities where all of a sudden you have to be professional from the waist up. We can get you some ties that commemorate the Capitol. You can see the brooch that we have here is also from our collection. Oh, there's the Constitution and the Liberty Bell on the tie. All those are available. We also, in addition to these, what we call lunch bites with Steve and Jane, which is sort of an informal conversation, please send in your questions. We really look at this as a conversational moment between Steve with all of his expertise and our participants, wherever you may be. And then we have a scholar series, which we do on Wednesdays. And that scholar series, the next scholar we have is next Wednesday, May 27th. And David Gerleman will be presenting on Benjamin Brown French and the Civil War Washington. Now, Benjamin Brown French has been identified as Lincoln's major domo. He was a sharp-eyed political observer, the commissioner of public buildings, who had a lot to do with the development of this town. So we invite you to join us next week, both Wednesday and Thursday, for the Scholar Series and the Lunch Bites with Jane and Steve, where Steve is the expert and I am the interrogator. But next week we'll be at First Street Northeast at C and Constitution. And those of you who are Washington visitors may think about, oh my goodness, why is the monocle still there in the middle of a parking lot? Steve is going to tell that story. He's going to tell the story about the Carroll Arms Hotel and other activities that were there at that particular intersection. So that's what is coming up in new activities coming ahead. And so Steve, with all that said, here we are one more time at the corner. And tell us, where are we? What did it look like back in the day? And how did it get to look the way it does now?
Good afternoon. We're going to talk about the intersection of Delaware and Constitution Avenue. Every corner around the Capitol has a story, has a lot of stories, because we've been active there. People have been active there and cared about this area since it was chosen in 1791. And so we've collected a few of these in particularly in our book, Creating Capitol Hill, that you can see the cover of here. And so I'm going to take some of the stories from that and add some from my own experience and research. Let's start with the L'Enfant map. We're going to go through the three maps that we've been using each week. This is the original plan, and the arrow there shows you the corner that we're talking about. That outline of the Capitol is L'Enfant's, so that's not actually the building that was built. But that is the location of the building that we did build, and you can see that this is a block behind the front block. That's what we talked about last week. This is the map from 1801 showing the buildings that existed, and again, the blue arrow is showing you the corner that we're talking about. The block below that is the one that we talked about last week. And so we're going to be talking about this stretch. The angled street there that the arrow is on is Delaware Avenue, and the cross down there is now Constitution Avenue. Originally it was called B Street out of the alphabet. You can see the Capitol below where the word Capitol is. There are those two rectangles. The darkened one is the Senate chamber, the original Senate that had been built by that point. Right here, I forgot I've got this cursor I can use. And then below is the empty square, and that is the House of Representatives. The foundation had been laid for it, but it had problems, and so they just didn't build it until later. So that's the situation in 1801. And what you can see is along the avenue up here, there are some structures. There are 4 of them shown here, and then one down here. And that's what we're going to talk about in particular. This is the Latrobe's map that was made after the British burned the neighborhood. And it, again, the blue arrow is pointing to the location of the corner that we're talking about. And we're going to talk about the buildings in that square. The profile in the center there is Daniel Carroll. This is the only image from his lifetime that remains. So we don't know anything much else about what he looked like, but that he is the one who's developing the neighborhood, and we're going to talk about what he did today. This is the map taken from Latrobe. It's blown up, and you can see on the left is Delaware Avenue. And there's an interesting thing to note about this block, and that is the 2 vertical lines running right along here indicate that there was an alley there. And that and you can see that the alley came out on, this is B Street or Constitution Avenue down here. So the alley is off here. And you have a structure here of some kind that, since it's along the alley, we can imply that it is outbuildings for these buildings over here. If this were outbuildings for the buildings down here along the street, then it would be stretched along here. So the alley is going this way, and the buildings are here. Those are probably stables and storage areas and that sort of thing, even slave quarters for the buildings that are along here. If you remember back up here, this map shows 4 buildings there, and that alley is going to be running right along here. This shows 4, but we know that that by the time of this, there were 6, and they were all built by Daniel Carroll. Across the street from that, then, is this location. This is what it looks like today. And where that big tree is, this area right in here, was the tavern that we talked about last week that was built. And off to the right here is Delaware Avenue. So the tavern was burned by the British, but the houses that were along the street this way were not. And so we're going to talk about those. This is the way it looks now. This is the Russell Senate Office Building. We're standing now by that tree that was in the previous shot and looking back. And so this is what it looks like today. This is Delaware Avenue. And the interesting thing about it is, why did they make the houses face Delaware Avenue and not B Street or Constitution toward the Capitol building? And so we go back here and look, and you can see that there's a block here. The tavern and so forth is here, and it's going to block the view of the Capitol from this house, which was along B Street. And so these houses back here wouldn't have seen it either. And that would be the problem along here, is that this block was being developed, and so you wouldn't be able to see the Capitol building. And what you can see is interesting and is related to this blue arrow over here. This squiggly line here is Tiber Creek. And this area from these houses over to Tiber Creek is a steep hill. And so from these houses, you have a really spectacular view. And I think that's the reason why they built the houses there and not along Constitution Avenue or B Street at that time. So I went up on the terrace. You can see on the terrace here in front of the Russell building. So I went up there and took a photograph across Delaware Avenue. And you can see it's under construction at the moment, so I wasn't able to take some pictures, although I got some historic ones. But you get a sense of the slope here and the rather steep hill. Here, I've backed off from the intersection again, and again along here, you can tell that the land is dropping off here. You can see those are parked cars along there, getting further and further down. But here is the historic painting from 1814 done right after the Capitol was burned by George Munger. And you get a sense of how steep this hill was. The ruins off to the right are the George Washington houses that we'll talk about later. But they were the only thing that was along here when the British burned, and the British did burn them. But this gives you an idea of how spectacular the view was from those houses along Delaware Avenue. This map shows you the view. These are the houses here. And the view out here, you can see there's, these are George Washington's houses here. But the view out to the right here is pretty spectacular. And so that is why those houses were built there. So these houses along here were much fancier than these along Constitution Avenue. And those are the ones we want to talk about. Daniel Carroll built them very early. So they were, at least some of them were there by the time the government moved here or within the first year. And what we're going to talk about is 1816. And here again is the view. This is a view that I showed you last week, a drawing done by Latrobe in 1813, looking from the other side of this view and back toward the Capitol. So off to the right is the Capitol, still in the two pieces. And by 1813, the House chamber has been built. And so you've got two separate buildings with the empty space in between for the rotunda. We think that this building here is probably Tomlinson's Tavern, which was about to be burned the next year. Over here you have Irish Town. These are small dwellings built for the workers that were working on the Capitol and building the rest of the city. And here is the indication. This right here, it would be the top of Washington's houses. And this is the slope here, and I've marked over here where Tiber Creek was. So at that time, it would have been seen, and it's on the drawing here. These poplars down here are Pennsylvania Avenue, and the ones up here are East Capitol Street. So that gives you an idea of what you could see. Not much had been built on the slopes, and what was built is this kind of building, which was temporary and wooden. And in his map here, Latrobe does not draw in the wooden buildings. Only buildings that he took inventory of were the brick ones that were considered more permanent. So we don't know from that map what had been built at that point. This shows you the slope. I'm standing at the top and you get a sense of it. This is looking right straight down Constitution Avenue. You can see Washington Monument there, and the avenue goes right straight to the Potomac. Now I've gone down to the bottom of the hill, and you can see on the left there is Upper Senate Park. And that's what we've done with the slope today. This whole slope is a park. And this, I've stepped back a little bit to show you how steep the hill is at that point. And on the right is Upper Senate Park, and you can see it sloping up to the right here. Here, the blue arrow marks where Tiber Creek is. You may not be aware that there's a creek there, but it flows along Louisiana Avenue, which is the street on the other side of the park here. And this is a shot of Louisiana Avenue. And at the end there is Union Station. Well, underneath Louisiana Avenue is Tiber Creek. It has been not just channelized, but put into a pipe. And so it is the view from these houses that are the greatest asset. They can look down the block and see the Capitol building, but from the houses looking straight ahead, they can see the whole city. And here you get a sense of the Latrobe map. The houses are along over here. That's Delaware Avenue. And then this is the slope, and these blocks now are Upper Senate Park. Here is Tiber Creek flowing along here very nicely. These, as you can see, are tiny lots that were laid out, and the buildings would have been wooden if there are any buildings built there at all. We don't know that there were any, and certainly not in Latrobe's drawing, but this is likely where Irish Town is that Latrobe was writing about. There were some brick buildings down here along Pennsylvania Avenue, and here you can see the poplars that had been planted all along Pennsylvania Avenue. And then up here you've got brick buildings, and that location may be where Latrobe was looking from. So the point is that these houses have this spectacular view. And there's in these houses are, we know by 1816, are 7 women. And 6 of them are Daniel Carroll's female relatives. So he has built these substantial houses, and his relatives are renting or owning them. It is interesting to know who these women were. The one of the 7 that is not related to Daniel Carroll was Susanna Crawford. And she is married to William Crawford, who is the Secretary of War. We talked about the Secretary of the Treasury a couple of weeks ago. But the Secretary of War lives here as well. And in October of 1816, he becomes Secretary of the Treasury. So he's living in one of these houses. He was previously a senator from Georgia and was President pro tem of the Senate at the time after the death of George Clinton, vice president. There is no vice president, so William Crawford has been is the president pro tem of the Senate, which at that point made him number 2 in line to be president. So if anything had happened to the president at that time, he would have been president. He was a candidate for president in 1816, but lost to James Monroe. Although one at that time one did not declare one's candidacy. But he was the leading anti-Jackson Democratic candidate and was supported by some of the leadership. In 1824, he in fact becomes a leading candidate, the leading anti-Jackson Democratic candidate, and was supported by former Presidents Jefferson and Madison to succeed James Monroe. But that is the famous election that had to be determined in the House of Representatives between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams won because Andrew Jackson said there was a corrupt bargain made with Henry Clay, who was the 3rd candidate, and William Crawford was the 4th. So that's how important William Crawford is. But this is back in 1816 when he's Secretary of War and about to become Secretary of the Treasury. The second woman is Katharine Brent. She's the wife of William Brent, who was a lawyer. There was a congressman named William Brent, but this is not that congressman. But the Brents are an old Maryland family, and Daniel Carroll of Duddington was married to one of the Brent women. Katharine Brent Diggs is the widow of George Diggs. The Diggs family is also an old Prince George's County family. They have plantations at both Oxon Hill and Bladensburg. And Daniel Carroll's daughter married William Diggs. And so there are all sorts of connections with the Diggses and the Brents. The next woman is Anna Maria Livingston. She is wife of what was then a former congressman from Louisiana named Robert Livingston. And this is the New York family of Livingstons, but they have picked up and moved to New Orleans where there was lots of money to be made, and he becomes the congressman immediately. Anna Maria Livingston is the daughter of Katharine Brent Diggs. So she's living there. Then Elizabeth Collins Lee is the wife of Richard Bland Lee. Richard Bland Lee is the commissioner of the district and then becomes the chief in charge of the claims commission that pays off the people whose properties were destroyed by the British in 1814. But more important historically and recently is that he is one of the votes that was changed by the deal in the musical Hamilton. If you remember this, Alexander Hamilton has lunch with James Madison and Thomas Jefferson because Hamilton's program has failed in the Congress, and they work out a deal whereby Madison will get 3 members of the House of Representatives to change their votes on the issue of Hamilton's program and the establishment of the National Bank in exchange for Hamilton's agreeing that and providing votes for the capital city to be located here along the Potomac River. So this is the great bargain that is celebrated in the room where it happened in the musical Hamilton. And Richard Bland Lee is one of those votes. He lost his seat for that. All 3 of them that changed their votes did lose their seats. And he is then rewarded with becoming commissioner of the district, and later on is in charge of paying the claims. Well, interestingly enough, we talked a few weeks ago about the fact that Sewell, who built the Sewell Belmont House that we talked about on the corner of 2nd and Constitution, didn't get paid off until 1856, and then only then by a special bill through the Congress. He was never paid through the claims, even though his building was burned by the British. But that means that Richard Bland Lee is the one who would not pay that claim, even though he is related to Sewell through his wife. And Anne Matilda Lee is the daughter of Elizabeth Collins Lee and Richard Bland Lee. And so she's there. And so these are the 7 women who sign a letter in May 1816, essentially a petition from the women who lived in these 6 houses to Thomas Law. They complain that he is building houses lower down, probably near or around the creek. That would be in this area. It might be some of these houses in here, and they're complaining about them. And here's a quote from the letter. It's erecting structures, quote, for the purpose of being inhabited by families of a class and description very unpleasant and troublesome. And quote, immediately in front of their houses is where he's doing this, not only obstructing their view, but in every respect incommoding them. So they've got this spectacular view, and what is happening is that Thomas Law is building buildings there that they don't want to look at. And it says, inhabited by families of a class and description very unpleasant and troublesome. So that says to us, Irish and Africans. So we go back. This is the Irish town that Latrobe has drawn in his drawing that he could see between him and these houses that we're talking about. And we have this drawing, which is from much later. It's 1882. And this notes a cabin within 3 squares of the Capitol. Now, there aren't very many places by 1882 that would be within 3 squares of the Capitol that might have buildings that appeared like this. And so this is probably along Tiber Creek. And you can see there's been a lot of erosion here in front of the house. And so this may very well be one of the houses that the ladies were complaining about. Now, you can see there have been things added on to the house here, but this structure right here would match what we understand Thomas Law was building for the ordinary people. Back here, it's going to be these houses like this. Now, these don't show chimneys, but this is probably what the ladies were complaining about, that they had to look at the homes of these Irish people and African Americans, and they don't want to look at that. Now, furthermore, they demand that the buildings be removed, and that it be removed to remote lots, quote, so that same inconvenience may not be felt by any of the respectable inhabitants of the hill. They want the whole thing moved out of sight. So this was the situation on Capitol Hill in 1816. This is after the hill has been burned in 1814 after those structures. And so everything's being rebuilt, and these ladies want their view not to include these houses. Now,
Steve, do you have a minute for a couple questions from the your fans in the audience land? One of the questions is, people were thinking about the Dubliner restaurant and bar. Is that from the historic Irish town, or is that a newer feature?
The Dubliner is newer, but I believe it was named because that was an Irish neighborhood. The whole area at Union Station was known, which would be further up Tiber Creek. And remember, Tiber Creek runs right underneath Union Station today. And that neighborhood was known as Swampoodle. There's even a plaque about it in Union Station. And that was the lower class Irish area.
And so
the Dubliner is definitely a reference to that. But it also was started by some Irish Americans who lived on Capitol Hill and were involved in real estate.
Okay. Now, the Tiber Creek question, people were fascinated about Tiber Creek now runs underneath Louisiana Avenue. Just as, similar type things have been done on other places. Do you know, has there ever been discussions about opening portions of Tiber Creek to create a park or a natural area, or is that not something that's come up to your knowledge?
By the time Tiber Creek was covered over, it was the city sewer. And there were no other sewers, and so it was covered over because it stunk. And Tiber Creek runs underneath Constitution Avenue. Constitution Avenue follows the path of Tiber Creek. And if you go to the end of Constitution Avenue, there by Lincoln Memorial, you can see a hole in the bulkhead, and that is where Tiber Creek flows out into the Potomac. So Tiber Creek still exists. It flows underneath Constitution Avenue, but there isn't enough flow in it to do very much anyway. That was always a problem. They made it into a canal, which we'll talk about another time, but the canal never had enough water in it. It was always a problem. One quick note, they developed a lock and a location to hold the water in Tiber Creek, and that structure was called the Watergate, and that is the origin of the term Watergate, was trying to keep the water in Tiber Creek. But no, that would be pretty much impossible. However, Tiber Creek flooded a few years ago, and there was way too much water to be held in the pipe, and so the water went into the basement of the National Archives and was flowing down Constitution Avenue.
Well, there you go. Little known facts. And you mentioned the Washington houses sort of in passing, and a couple people asked, is that where George Washington lived? What is the story of the George Washington house?
Okay, a quick summary, because I'm going to probably spend a whole session on the Washington houses. But George Washington built two houses there. They were for speculation, just like everybody else in the area, and they became they were the two fanciest houses on the hill besides Duddington itself, and are quite historic. So there's a whole session just to be done about those.
Well, stay tuned. Upcoming, coming attractions.
Yeah, if I get started on that story, we won't have anything else to talk about.
It always gives us great joy to have new things to look forward to. So back to Delaware and Constitution. I just wanted to let our folks have an opportunity to weigh in.
Okay, this man is William Causton. And we introduced him a couple of weeks ago. Behind him in this drawing is the Bank of Washington, and he was the night porter. But he does not look like he's dressed as the night porter. And as a matter of fact, he ended up as a major investor in Capitol Hill real estate. But he is a freed slave. He was a slave of Martha Washington's, and Martha left him to her granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis Law, and he ends up as the property, probably through the divorce between Law and Eliza. He, at any rate, becomes the property of Thomas Law, who freed him. And then he goes to work for Daniel Carroll at the bank as the night porter. But he invests in Capitol Hill real estate. He owned a lot of properties. And the reason I bring him up at this point is that he, at the time of his death in 1842, he owned some of the buildings that these ladies are complaining about. We don't know where they were, or we would presume that they were more substantial than that shack that I showed you a moment ago. But he leaves these properties to his sons, and with the admonition that they are not to be sold. Of course, at the time of the Revolution, all of the states abolished entail, which is how you tie up a property to keep it from being sold by future generations. But he's trying to establish this. He knows how important land ownership was at that time. And so he tells his sons in his will to hang on to that property, to those properties, and not sell them. So he's the one person that we know is involved in that neighborhood, probably building some houses. Some of them may have been substantial. He wouldn't have gone to all that trouble probably if those houses were the wooden ones. And so probably he's involved in establishing some of the brick houses that were built on those small lots that we showed in the previous map. Now, we're done with the letter and with that neighborhood. I want to go back up to the location where the Russell building is now. And this is one of the buildings that was torn down for the Russell building. It was built by Buckner Thurston, who's a major figure. He was a congressman and a judge in the area. And this house continued until it was torn down sometime around 1905 for the Russell Senate Office building. The interesting thing to me is that you see on the front is this sign that says Eastern Dispensary. On the side is a sign that says Casualty Hospital. And interestingly enough, there is an old building recently renovated at Massachusetts Avenue and 7th Street, is now part of a senior citizen home that was just refurbished in the last few years. But that small section of that property, it was called Casualty Hospital. You'll see on a lot of old maps, it's called that. By the time I moved to Washington into that neighborhood, it was called Rogers Memorial Hospital. And then they changed the name of it to Capitol Hill Hospital and tried to get themselves billed as the emergency room for Capitol Hill and get Congress to give them money for a state-of-the-art emergency room to have one near the Capitol building. But that eventually failed, and the emergency room for the Capitol is the George Washington Hospital. But Casualty Hospital lived on for a long time, and apparently it started in this building. But this is one of the buildings that was torn down for the Russell building. But it probably the houses that we're talking about, the ones that were around on Delaware Avenue, were nicer than this one. But this was probably a pretty nice house when it was built. This is what Upper Senate Park looks like today. This is an older photograph because, as I showed you before, it's got all these construction barricades around it now. But I found this one online, an old view of what Upper Senate Park looks like. And the sidewalks are an extension of North Capitol Street, to give you an indication. And it was along here that George Washington built those two houses that we'll talk about. But this is what the park looked like, and the park is the result of some later activity. But I want to go back now to the houses, including Buckner Thurston's here and the ones where the ladies lived, because this became an interesting neighborhood later on after the Revolution of 1848 in Germany. What happened was that the middle class in Germany had instituted a revolution in 1848, and it failed. And so many of the professionals and middle class people knew that there was going to be a retaliation, and they didn't want to live under a repressive regime anymore. And so you have a whole group of people that emigrated to the United States called the 48ers for 1848. And they are the German middle class that comes to the United States. And a whole bunch of them who were science oriented settled on Capitol Hill and lived in some of these same houses that I'm talking about. The reason is that the Coastal Survey of the United States was headquartered on Capitol Hill. It was called the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and it was one of the major funders of science in the whole world. One of the things that gets lost in all of the other history is that the Congress of the United States has been the major funder of science in the whole world from practically the first Congress. And so the logical place for these Germans to come was Capitol Hill, where they could deal with the Congress and be involved in these geographical surveys and scientific studies that were being funded by the Congress. At one point, there were 6 different surveys going on. The Coastal Survey that was ongoing every year. There was an Army survey. The Army was getting acquainted with the Louisiana Purchase, and later on with the territory we got from the Mexican War and the Gadsden Purchase, and all of that is being run out of the Coast and Geodetic Survey and the Army. And then there were 3 different railroad surveys going on, and other people being funded. And at one point, Congress discovered it was funding 60 different surveys, and they were not coordinated with each other. Some of them were duplicated and so forth. So they changed and established a larger agency, which we know as the Geological Survey, to try to coordinate all of these surveys. But at this point, that hadn't been done yet, and these scientists are all here in Washington because this is where the funding is coming from. And the really funny story is that one of them made microscopes and telescopes that required crosshairs. And at that time, the best fiber that you could use for the crosshairs for a lens was a spider web. And this German scientist would not allow any spiders to be disturbed in his house. There were spider webs all over the place because he always needed fresh spider webs for his instruments. The neighborhood deteriorated with all those spider webs all over it. And so the buildings were torn down then for the Russell Senate Office building. Then along comes the McMillan Plan, which was for the centennial of the city, and we have a replanning of the city. And the city that we see today is basically what that commission established. They're the ones who made the National Mall the way it is. They're the ones that decided the buildings should be white stone along the mall. So all of the buildings, except the Smithsonian Castle, which is earlier, and the Arts and Industries building next to it, all of the rest of the buildings are basically the same style until the Museum of African American History and Culture, which broke the pattern. But they came up with this idea. And among the things they did was the railroad station was in the middle of the mall, and they needed to clear that out of the way. And so they prevailed on the railroads to consolidate several stations and create Union Station. And they made Union Station part of the Capitol grounds. It actually is considered part of the Capitol grounds, and it is heated by the Capitol's heating plant to show you that it is part of the whole neighborhood. And so to provide an entrance to Union Station, let me find that. Here we go. Here you can see this is the view. Upper Senate Park is on the right, and you can see Union Station at the end there. And so Tiber Creek is covered over at that point, and this park is established using the view that came from those houses. This is done by the Macmillan Commission, and the major staff member of the Macmillan Commission is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. So the park there, this photograph is standing in the park and looking back at the Russell Building. And the idea of this park comes from the Macmillan Plan, which is the work largely of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. What they wanted to do was to create a grand entrance to the city from Union Station. Most people would be coming, particularly the prosperous ones, would be coming to Washington by train. And so they wanted to keep it clear, the sight lines clear, so that when you walked out of Union Station, you're looking right at the Capitol building. And so the angle that Union Station is at puts the view of the Capitol right straight in front of you when you walk out of the front of Union Station. You're looking right down Delaware Avenue at the Capitol building. And the purpose of this park was to preserve that view. And it is the grand entrance to the Capitol. There is one interesting remnant along here, and that is this. Now, on the left, at the top left photograph, there is along Delaware Avenue, and right at the top of the photo there is that tree where the tavern used to be. This is across the street from the Russell Senate Office Building. And here you see there's a slab left, and then you can see this electrical equipment sticking up out of the ground. And in the slide on the right, you see the relationship between those two things. This is a leftover area for press conferences for the Senate. I showed you the swamp a few weeks ago where they give press conferences today. And this, when they were building the visitor center, they could not use that. And so they created this one. And there even were wooden sort of bleachers for standing here. And if you can see where the red dot is here, this is where the lectern would be. And the senator would be standing here, and behind him would be this wonderful view of the Capitol building. And then the bleacher was in here, and hidden behind the bleacher was this area where they could plug in the equipment for press conferences. Now, the bleachers deteriorated quickly and they tore down the wooden structure, but they've left the slab here and the electrical connections. And I'm assuming that's because they want to be prepared in case they have to have another remote press conference area. They've still got it here. So they have not torn it up, even though they are renovating the park there, and it would be a logical time for them to tear it up. So that is a remnant left there in Upper Senate Park. I used to give tours starting at Union Station at the Metro, and we had to walk right past here. And so they would keep a lectern out there. So I would have my people along the tour get their picture taken as though they were giving a press conference with the Capitol behind them. And I'd tell them to point their finger and say, "And then I told the president," as part of their press conference. So Jane, do we have some questions?
We do have a couple questions. Somebody wanted to be reminded, what year was the Senate Russell Office Building built?
1909 is when it opened. The plan was, well, I believe, was published about 1902, and the Russell and Cannon buildings were on that plan, but they both opened in 1909.
And tell us, Louisiana's Avenue is in a pretty prominent place. How did Louisiana get that particular avenue? Was there a member of Congress at the time Union Station was opened, or is that just a happenstance? How did that occur?
The avenues, particularly around the Capitol building, relate to the order in which the states were admitted to the Union. The major avenues in the Old City are the 13 original, and Louisiana, what is it, about 16 or 17? So it's an early state, and that's why, but the avenue as we have it now was not done until the Senate Park was established and I'm not sure. Louisiana Avenue may have been where the Federal Triangle is now. That's also part of the McMillan plan. And I think that's the point at which they had to move the avenue. I think it was originally in where the Federal Triangle is now.
Now, one more question about Tiber Creek. One of our listeners noticed that there's a waterfall at the National Museum of the American Indian, and she had heard that was a tribute to Tiber Creek flowing nearby there. Is that something you've heard, or is that?
No, and my guess is it's not specifically related to Tiber Creek, but to the fact that Native Americans have spiritual ties to water bodies and flowing water. And I mean, one could make the connection because that's the nearest one, but the museum is not even on a location where Tiber Creek was. Although one of the canals, that's right, one of the canals would have gone right past the museum. So yeah, one could make the connection, but I don't know that it's specific like that.
And you talked about the fact that the United States Congress is the biggest funder of science, and one of our listeners really picked up on that and was wondering, what's the relationship between the funding of science, the investment in the Smithsonian? Is there some kind of a back and forth between those two engagements?
The Smithsonian, of course, is a major funder of science, and that comes from the Congress as well. But you've got the Geological Survey, and you've got Army surveys, Army Mapping Service, and lots of things like that. The Smithsonian is a result, in fact, of this commitment to science being made at the time in the 1840s. And in particular, John Quincy Adams is the one connected with that. He's the one that pursued this legacy that we had received that we had been offered from Smithson. And there was a lot of opposition to even accepting the money. But we did that and had to fight it through the British courts and so forth. And so the Smithsonian is part of our commitment to science. And that is why John Quincy Adams wanted us to have that money, and that institution is to institutionalize science. But there are lots of other ways in which we have funded science as well.
And then returning to the Daniel Carroll and the conversation that you've been having over these many weeks about him, what is there a relationship between Daniel Carroll and Charles Carroll, who is known for establishing Carrollton?
Yes. They are related. It's kind of an uncle, but there were lots of interrelationships there. But Charles Carroll was the dominant figure in the Carroll family. Daniel Carroll aspired to that same position, and in fact, when Daniel Carroll's father died, Charles Carroll was the guardian of the properties of Daniel Carroll until he came of age. And Daniel Carroll came of age just at the point where the city of Washington was established on his land, including his land, and so he had great aspirations. But one of the points of the book is that history was not kind to Daniel Carroll of Duddington, as it has been to Charles Carroll, and so he doesn't get the credit that he deserves for his role as well. But Charles Carroll was the dominant figure in the whole state of Maryland, and historically is of great importance in American history. He's one of the only people to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and was the only Catholic involved, and so forth. At any rate, he has a great role, and Daniel Carroll is a member of that family and aspired to becoming a dominant figure in the family, but it did not achieve that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, so that is that's the story of the Constitution in Delaware Avenue, and we encourage you to ask questions. You can feel free to email more questions to me, and I will try to answer all of them. I am purposely leaving a lot of things dangling here, like Washington's houses, because as Jane knows, I could talk for 10 or 12 hours on these things without running out of steam. So we'll leave you with some other things, and any question that you ask, I will try to deal with, because even I learn a lot of things from the questions that people ask. I hadn't thought of the connection between that American Indian Museum fountain and Tiber Creek, but the more I think about it, the more I think definitely Tiber Creek was the nearest water to where the museum is.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. One final, would you say the name again of the guy with the spiders? Somebody.
I never gave his name. I went looking for the article that was written about that and never could find it. So I'm shaky on my documentation there.
All right. No wonder nobody could remember it.
In fact, if anyone listening read that article, I couldn't even find where it was. I thought it was in Washington History, but I couldn't find it. It may have been in the Journal of American History. But if anybody knows where that article is, please let me know.
Well, we have such a fabulous group of listeners that I believe by next week, someone will have the answer to what was the man's name with the spiders. We have a couple other questions, but we'll hold those for next week. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for your lively presentation, your willingness to just open yourself to any question that people might dream up, and your ability to sort of walk us through the history and the current reality of our precious Capitol Hill. We want to thank all of you who've been on the call and on the webinar. We want to remind you that we hope you'll become a member of the Capitol Historical Society, that you can support us by buying lovely ties like Steve has, or even we have scarves. This is the scarf that commemorates the Bermuda corridors. And so one day we'll talk about the Bermuda corridors inside the United States Capitol, and you can have that beautiful design to pep up your look when you're on your latest Zoom call. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being on. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Lauren, for the technical work. We look forward to talking to you all next week. Be well. Bye.